Welcome to the Codcast from Commonwealth Magazine. I'm Michael Jonas. With last year's election of Donald Trump and his talk about bad hombres and Mexican rapists, it's hard to feel too optimistic about the prospects for comprehensive immigration reform. Trump's election seems to make the partisan divide on the issue more stark than ever. But Ali Noorani, our guest on this week's Codcast, says a solution to the immigration debate isn't just a matter of the political dynamics in Washington. He says it has to start with conversations about culture and values in communities across the country. Ali has been having those conversations in his role as executive director of the National Immigration Forum, a Washington-based advocacy group. A lot of those conversations have been with conservative religious figures, law enforcement officials, and business leaders. Ali says we can find more common ground on the immigration debate than people think. He's written a book about what he's learned from those conversations and from some of the failures of earlier immigration reform efforts. His name may be familiar to some Massachusetts listeners because he spent a decade in Boston, where he was director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. Ali Noorani, welcome to the Codcast.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So you've spent a good number of years in the thick of the very charged debate over immigration reform in America, and it's often portrayed as another issue with a sharp partisan divide. But you say that's not quite so, and you and your organization, the National Immigration Forum, have spent a good deal of time in so-called red states and making common cause with more moderate and conservative leaders there. What is it that we've gotten wrong in the conventional narrative on immigration reform?
Well, I think that, for many, many years, those of us who care about immigration reform, we've always thought about this as an issue that's all about politics or it's all about policy. What I have learned about the immigration debate is that I think the majority of Americans see this as a question about culture and a question about values. Because, when somebody moves into, your community who is, whether they're from Mexico, Morocco or Singapore, the first question for that person who's been there for generations is, okay, this person's moving in, is my culture going to change? Are my values going to change? Is my neighborhood going to change? And I just think we as advocates have to do a much better job and be much more thoughtful about how we are engaging the American public on this question of immigrants and immigration.
And talk a little about sort of how you came to that understanding. And in your book, There Goes the Neighborhood, which I'd recommend to all our listeners. It was a really interesting and fun read to sort of follow along in your travels and the conversations you had with people. But as part of that conversation, you came to this realization, and you write that in some ways, I don't know if you'd sort of call it an epiphany, but it sort of crystallized back in 2010 when there was a big debate going on in Washington over immigration reform, and at the same time, Congress was considering scrapping the so-called "don't ask, don't tell" policy regarding gay service members in the military. So, help us understand a little how you sort of came to this view of the immigration debate as one that really needs to be viewed as an issue about culture more than politics or policy per se.
Well, it actually goes back even before that moment in 2010, which I'll talk about, but it goes back to a conversation you and I had in 2007 when you were writing for the Globe, and I remember I think I cited this in the book, where Bob Putnam had just come out with some new research where, to paraphrase, he found that diversity was a challenge for the majority of Americans, and he challenged our assumption that diversity and was a good thing and welcomed by people. And I remember telling you, and I think you quoted me in that Globe article, and I said something like, well, we can either dismiss these findings or we can figure out what's underneath them, and really how do we engage people. So that conversation and that study,
I do remember the conversation now, and his report, which I think was sort of jarring to people, and I think the headline they put on it was "The Downside of Diversity," which made it particularly provocative, since we're always talking about celebrating diversity, and diversity is the strength of communities. And he found that while it could be in the long run, there's some short-term challenges when communities change in their makeup.
Exactly. So, I mean, that report and our conversation kind of got buried into the nooks and crannies of my largely empty brain. And then in 2010, it really started to crystallize for me, where in December 2010, two things happened in the United States Senate. One was, and this was on December 18th, 2010 specifically, in the morning, the DREAM Act was defeated. And in the afternoon, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was successfully repealed.
And the DREAM Act would have done what?
The DREAM Act is legislation that would have granted legal status for young undocumented immigrants who, after whether they're going to college, enlisting in the armed services, or doing community service, once they had done that for a number of years, they would have been able to apply for legal status. And looking back from that moment of December 18th, 2010, I realized that, we lost, those of us who were fighting for the DREAM Act, we lost for a very specific reason that, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was successfully repealed. Because the LGBT movement, they made a case to the American public around the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell based on what it means to serve your nation openly or freely, what it means to be a part of a loving relationship. They never talked about politics. They never talked about policy. They really talked about what are the personal and the cultural questions behind being able to serve your nation openly and freely. Those of us in the immigrant rights movement over the course of 2010, that was a big midterm election year. We doubled down on the politics. We registered voters in Nevada. We registered voters in Colorado. We made sure that people understood where the candidates were on the issues. We won the politics, but we lost the cultural battle, and therefore we lost the legislation that day. So, what I realized is that as an organization, we needed to do a much better job of engaging the American public in a cultural conversation as opposed to a political debate.
And you write in the book about a lot of those conversations that unfolded in the years after that. And just talk a little bit about how that unfolded, and the ways in which you were surprised. There was just great vignettes in the book about your meetings with Mormon leaders in Utah, people part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and folks that you write quite frankly were not the kind of company that you were accustomed to keeping as kind of a progressive advocate who's been active in immigration issues for many years.
Right, and I was born and raised in California. Went to UC Berkeley. Spent 10 years in Boston. So I came into this new moment of, okay, how do I as an individual and the leader of an organization get out of my comfort zone? So there are a couple of things that happened that I think we really drew from. One was in the summer of 2010, in the state of Utah, there's a really significant flashpoint. Now, to take one more step back, is that in April 2010, in Arizona, SB 1070 was passed. This was the Show Me Your Papers law, which would have authorized local police officers to ask for immigration status. Utah was on the next on their list in terms of trying to pass this legislation. A group of conservative leaders from the Catholic Church, law enforcement, think tanks, the business community, other organizations came together and started thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that SB 1070 never makes it to Utah? And there was this particular moment in the summer of 2010 where it became very clear kind of what is possible, where 4 or 5 state workers took it upon themselves to release a list of thousands of names to law enforcement, alleging that these individuals were undocumented immigrants. In reality, these were just individuals with Hispanic surnames. But what happened was that the Utah Republican Attorney General, the Catholic Church, the Mormon leadership, business leadership, conservative thought leadership, all said that this is wrong. And over the remainder of the year, they banded together to pull together something called the Utah Compact, which was 5 very conservative sounding principles about the free market, the importance of family values, importance of national security, and that compact became a vehicle through which conservatives could have a constructive conversation about the need for immigration reform. So we looked at that and we said, okay, if Utah can do it, the most conservative state in the country, how do we replicate these types of relationships in different parts of the nation? And over the course of the next couple of years, we spent an incredible amount of time sitting down with conservative faith leaders, law enforcement leaders, and business leaders to understand how they and their constituencies or their communities engage in this question. And over time, we built out this coalition that's come to be known as Bibles, Badges, and Business for Immigration Reform. And the basic idea is that if you hold a Bible, you wear a badge, or you own a business, you want a common sense solution to the immigration system.
And as you made your way through these conversations and the efforts in these states, it just reinforced, I guess, your view that that even when it comes to business leaders, was that still sort of a question of culture and values, or some people would say the business community has been a more moderating voice, in the immigration debate in some ways, out of self-interest because they understand the role that immigration has played in the economy. How did the business community fit into this? The sort of way you're looking at how the debate is shaped.
So, up to that point, I would say that we would always go to the business community and ask them to talk about, kind of the bottom line implications of immigrants and immigration, and what was the economic benefit of the immigrant workforce, and that's important. But like you said, that it runs the risk of coming across as self-interested, and if you're a person who is just struggling with this issue for a variety of reasons, and you hear the Chamber of Commerce talk about the need for immigrant workers, your immediate response is, well, I can do that job, or the guy that I know down the street can do that job. And so what we found is that through this coalition of faith, law enforcement, business leaders, something happens to the way that business leaders talk about the issue. And the best part about this work is, before we do an event, there's, we're sitting in the green room, and you've got the pastor, the police chief, and the business owner. The pastor is sitting there thinking, okay, they look at the business owner, they're saying, okay, I don't want to talk about visa reform or, the number of H-1B visas you need.
Right.
Right. The business owner is looking at the pastor and saying, well, I don't want to get, caught up in some sort of a social conservative cause here. And the police chief is looking at both of them saying, what am I even doing in this room? But what happens when they come out and start talking to the public is that, the business owner realizes that, they're not talking about the immigrant workforce as a cog in the wheel. Because they're sitting next to a pastor or their pastor and their police chief, they're talking about an immigrant workforce as part of their family and part of their community. So it adds a moral and a cultural element to the conversation from a business perspective. And what it means is for that American who's kind of struggling with this question, when they hear that business owner talk about the immigrant worker as kind of a fellow human being, it takes a little bit of anxiety out of the formula, and you start to open the door to a very different conversation.
Mm-hmm. And you write in the book that starting 2008, 2009, around the time of the Tea Party was at its peak, that was also when a lot of the anti-immigrant energy really started to boil up, and that there was just this sort of fear people had of the changes happening in the country. But I guess I wonder, hasn't that always been the case? I mean, is there something different about the moment we're in now? Because there's been a lot written about how, frankly, for all the the imagery of the Statue of Liberty, that there's always been resistance to newcomers, in whether they were Southern Europeans, Jewish immigrants, or others, in the 19th or 20th century, and now folks from other parts of the world today.
I mean, it's certainly the case. I mean, America's relationship with immigration has been very, let's just say complicated. Doris Meisner, who ran Immigration and Naturalization Services for President Clinton, told me in an interview for the book, she said, to paraphrase, Americans cherish immigration in hindsight, not so much in the present tense, which I just think that's always been the case. On the other hand, I think what is different now is that there is a confluence of factors that that lead Americans to think that they've lost control of their lives, and ultimately that means that their child may not do better than them. So you look at the stresses that globalization puts on local economies. That frankly, an education system that's not keeping up with the needs of our manufacturing sector, or our economy writ large. Changing demographics. I think all those
so I think
factors.
the fact that it's sort of happening during this period of this huge attention on stagnant income growth, income inequality, the kind of fraying of the middle class, that sort of is an overlay on the whole debate today that has changed it a lot.
And it's absolutely, and therefore it's easiest to blame the other. And right now, in this moment in time, the other is the immigrant. And the immigrant is seen as an economic threat, a national security threat, a cultural threat, to many people. And frankly, President Trump has capitalized on that anxiety.
Right. I guess one other thing I was struck by in the book is that is that while things were playing out in the political arena, you write that President Obama and the Obama administration was at many points kind of a disappointment in terms of how they handled the immigration issue. Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. So, in 2009 and 10, and even after that, I think that the administration, their theory was that if they increase enforcement, if they continue to target undocumented immigrants and increase their deportation numbers, Republicans will think, okay, well, we're good. You're enforcing the law. We'll trust you now. And I think that strategically that was a miscalculation, because at that moment in time in our history, perhaps this moment it continues now, there's very little appetite for a bipartisan approach to these challenges. And I think what the administration could have done better, and they did to a large degree once we got into 2013 and 14, is really start to reach across the political aisle, and not necessarily through Congress, but when the president sat down with evangelical leadership, when he sat down with law enforcement leadership, when he sat down with business leadership, he was reaching across the political spectrum without necessarily getting stuck in the political bubble that's Washington, D.C. And I just think that, if there's any chance of making change on this or any other issue, we need politicians who are kind of, and it's a strange thing to say, but are willing to kind of get out of the political bubble and act in an apolitical way.
Right. And the sort of more conservative leaders that you write about, and then in the political realm, some of the elected Republican officials, whether it was the Indiana Republican Attorney General or other folks you write about, did they was it risky for them to stake out the sort of ground that they did in reaching across and framing the immigration issue, as you've put it, in more sort of cultural terms than purely political or policy terms?
Absolutely. And I think that the those of us on, quote, the left, we have a tendency to kind of assume that conservatives should be doing the right thing, and they don't have a self-interest in their own agenda, much less their own ability to make change. But Greg Zeller was the Attorney General of the state of Indiana, a Republican. I think grew up kind of working for Dan Quayle and Dick Lugar, and he embodied Indiana. He was born and raised in the state, quiet-spoken, really thoughtful, arch or devout Catholic. And he told me the story of when then Governor Pence signed a letter saying that he didn't want Syrian refugees in the state, that Zeller, as Attorney General, his job was to defend the state's decision, but as a member of the board of directors of Catholic Charities, it was his moral responsibility to welcome refugees. And he talked to me about that the difference in roles there. But also at that point, Greg was running for Congress. He was caught in a pretty heated primary battle with a Tea Party Republican who he eventually lost to in large part because Greg was seen as a pragmatic, thoughtful, but still conservative Republican, but not conservative enough for this moment in time.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we continue to see some of those kind of things play out in the political arena where, it appears to be risky for Republicans to deviate from sort of that hard line because of the threat of primary challengers. I mean, it's just, right now, we're seeing that, potentially playing out in Arizona with Senator Flake. Mm-hmm. And, John McCain, who was, at one time one of the early leaders on the Republican side of trying to sort of push immigration reform. You write about him sort of moving more to the right, and he himself faced, primary challenge recently.
And which I think is why it's so important that, we are kind of getting, whether it's above or below the political battles, and creating the strategies and the conversations and the opportunities for folks to sit down across the political spectrum. And the way that I put it in the book is that, I feel like organizationally our motto is to meet people where they are, but not to leave them there. And that mm-hmm. means that, again, whether it's immigration or any of a number of other issues, we've got to figure out what are the points of agreement between conservatives and liberals, libertarians, and others on the spectrum, because we just right now the political structures as they're set up, they're driven by really small but powerful factions. And I think over time we can break through that if we continue to frankly create a debate, whether it's on the left or the right, of a more pragmatic way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that maybe is sort of played out a little under the radar. I mean, you write about. So would you say, at least at the state level, do you feel like the conversations and this effort that you were part of, the business badges and business coalition, it really did notch some victories that are a little bit of a roadmap?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I talked about the work in Utah, where you had faith, law enforcement, business leaders come together to stop SB 1070 and try mm-hmm. to come up with some innovative solutions. In Nebraska, Republicans, some of the folks that we've been working with there for a long time led an effort to pass state legislation so undocumented immigrant youth who got legal status through Deferred Action Program, the DACA program, they could get driver's licenses in Nebraska. So there are a number of examples where I think at the the city or the state level where Republicans or conservatives are frankly having an internal debate and coming out of that in a more constructive fashion.
Mm-hmm. And talk a little about how you sort of came to view the role of religion and religious leaders maybe a little differently. You write at one point in the book, you describe yourself as a liberal Muslim-ish guy from California, right. And I think the ish part is that, as you write, your family is Muslim, but you're not particularly religious or observant. Yet you found yourself in a lot of conversation and joining forces with folks who were really driven by religious belief, and finding that in some ways is one of the, I think, main anchors when you talk about needing to sort of move the conversation more toward one about culture than politics. So, I mean, a lot of that culture is really anchored in religious communities, primarily, different Christian faith groups in the country. Although, again, interestingly, at the very beginning of the book, you talk about then Senator Joe Lieberman and his strong Jewish faith really informing, some of his actions as well.
So growing up in Northern California, again, living in Boston, and it's not all about geography, but, like you mentioned, I grew up
You're a coastal elite, right? That's what
I
you're
know,
saying.
exactly. I'm totally part of the problem. I'm very comfortable with that.
Right.
But I grew up in a family that, like you said, we didn't practice religion. For a long time, I would look at faith leaders, skeptically, and really kind of question what the motives were. But I just realized that, if we're going to do this work, we have to understand where's the majority of the country on these questions, and engaging people through their faith, gives a window into somebody's values as opposed to engaging somebody on their politics, which you get a window into somebody's ideology, and those are, I think, very different things.
Right. And you talked about, I think at one point, a visit you went on with some leaders to maybe an immigration detention center on the border, the Mexican border in Brownsville, and how the folks you were with came away from it. And again, they were. It wasn't a big, high-minded policy discussion that hit them. It was really being confronted with seeing these kids, who had fled different dangers in Central America, and having to sort of reckon with that in the context, often of their own faith, of some understanding of what their faith teaches them about how to deal with those in need, or those facing some adversity.
And I guess what I've realized is that, and particularly within the evangelical community, is that there is a tension between the rule of law of the United States and the Bible, and laws must be followed. Yes, we live in a nation of laws, but those laws also must be just. And living in that tension is a real challenge for people who go to church every Sunday. For me to enter into those conversations and develop a relationship, I have to respect that tension. I have to understand that most Americans, they live somewhere between believing we are a nation of laws and believing we are an inclusive and welcoming nation. If I don't respect how people are grappling with that tension, I don't think we're going to solve many problems.
Mm-hmm. And so let's talk a little bit about, what in some ways is maybe now the elephant in the room on the whole immigration issue, and that was, the election of Donald Trump, who ran on this, very harsh anti-immigrant platform, one that, many people would say really sort of, demagogued the issue, villainized immigrants as the source of so much of the problem. I think he effectively really did, as we were talking earlier, join the issue of immigration with the insecurity that Americans are feeling economically about their place and their standing in the middle class, or wherever they position themselves. So it certainly feels like, and when it comes to pushing for some common understanding on immigration, or getting us to some resolution of the big looming issue about the 11 or 12 million undocumented immigrants here, that the election seems like a big step backwards.
So when I was writing the book last summer, and over the course of and it was right at the height of the presidential campaign, there was a particular survey that still sticks in my mind and it was an analysis of the Gallup survey, and it was their finding was that your Trump voter lived in a culturally isolated community and felt that their child would not do better than them. So it was this, so what Trump was able to tap into is this kind of anxiety about a changing America demographically, but that at the end of the day, all that people want is to make sure that kids are going to do better than them. And they felt that Donald Trump would fix that problem. And that's why, I mean, for us at this moment, and we've been doing this for a number of years, it's like everything that we want to advocate for in the realm of immigration policy has to be in the interest of the American worker and their family. And just yesterday, a couple days ago, I was speaking to a number of Korean leaders from across the country, and the majority of them were mothers themselves, and they were advocating for their undocumented children. They were standing in front of the White House, just talking to people as they would come and snap a picture of the White House. And what I realized is that their interest as mothers from Korea advocating for their kids was to make sure their kids are going to do better than them, just like that voter in Iowa who voted for Donald Trump. So how do we take that common interest and kind of move things forward? But the reality is Trump tapped into that, and we are where we are.
And I mean, just quickly, maybe give us a little take on some of his moves. I mean, he's pushing or backing a big change in legal immigration that would reduce the number of people admitted, and also change pretty dramatically the criteria for entering the country, which had been strongly based on family ties and relationships, and making it much more sort of a skill-based rules.
Yeah. So I think that President Trump, from the day he took office, has been more or less taking the country down a path of systematically dismantling our nation's immigration system. And then you can go back to the travel ban, all the enforcement executive orders that he signed on his early days. But earlier this summer, he endorsed legislation introduced by Senators Cotton and Perdue called the RAISE Act, Reforming American Immigration, something. There's some basement room in Congress that comes up with these great acronyms. But in any case, the RAISE Act would slash legal immigration by 50% and completely eviscerate the idea of family-based immigration. Our problem with that is, so number one, we agree that we need reforms to our legal immigration. On the other hand, according to the American Action Network, by the time we get to 2020, our economy is going to be facing a private sector worker shortage of 7.5 million. If we're
not solely at the high skills level,
across the spectrum,
right? Some people have said this sort of skill-based policy, mimics in some, to some extent, the way Canada deals with immigration in other countries. People have tried to say it's not such a a horrifying change.
Yeah. So when people compare the point system of Canada or Australia to the U.S., I think we're comparing apples and oranges. Our economy is exponentially larger than Canada's, and much more diverse. And I was in Idaho 3-4 weeks ago, and those dairy farmers, they depend on some pretty highly skilled workers to be milking those cows. But the federal government doesn't see a dairy worker as, quote, a skilled worker. So I think that you start peeling back the layer of the onion, and pretty quickly you realize that we need the skilled engineer as much as we need the skilled farm worker. And this RAISE Act does nothing to actually solve any problems.
Mm-hmm. And what about even more recently, just on Friday, the president's pardon of former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio? What did that say to you? Nothing good, I'm presuming.
Nothing good. Yeah, nothing good. I'm going to try to keep this family friendly, right?
Yeah.
Joe Arpaio.
But again, it sends this broad signal about the direction that the administration, the federal government, at least on the executive side, is taking, and how it's viewing this whole immigration issue.
Both Trump and Arpaio kind of present themselves to the public as kind of law and order, politicians. mean, the fact is that Joe Arpaio saw himself above the law and was convicted of contempt of court, criminal contempt of court. Donald Trump, didn't build a case of why Joe Arpaio should be pardoned. In essence, endorsed Arpaio's practices of profiling immigrants, of holding them in inhumane conditions. In the language of his, when he said, I'm a big supporter of your work. You're an American patriot.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the message that President Trump sent to this through this pardon is that immigrants are a threat to the society, and we need more law enforcement like Joe Arpaio, which
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day makes us all of us a whole lot less safe.
Right. And you're still, I guess, in spite of this all, you still feel some grounds for optimism about where we can go on all this, even in the Trump era?
I'm optimistic about this because I think that the majority of Americans are good people, and I said this earlier that I think the folks are living between the spectrum of being a nation of laws and being a welcoming nation. And how do we help people move across that spectrum so that they see immigrants and immigration as a value to them in their lives? We just talked to too many, pastors, police chiefs, business owners, a number of whom voted for Donald Trump, who are saying, we need a constructive approach on this issue. So, I remain optimistic that we will reform the immigration system. We just have a little bit more work to do than we probably expected a year or two ago.
Great. Well, Ali, I want to thank you for a great conversation and recommend to folks listening, pick up Ali's book. It's a great read. There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. So thanks again. It was really great to talk.
Hey, thank you so much, Michael. I really, really appreciate this, and it's great to talk to you.
And you have been listening to another installment of the Codcast from Commonwealth Magazine. You can subscribe to the Codcast via SoundCloud or iTunes. I'm Michael Jonas. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.